And welcome back to Straight Talk Africa Live from Washington. Once again, it's time to bring in my colleague and social media reporter. Over to you, Mariama.
Well, thanks, Esther. The World Health Organization has declared a global emergency over the spike in cases of microcephaly as it might be connected to the Zika virus. Most people who contract the virus have mild fever, skin rash, and conjunctivitis, which generally last for 2 to 7 days. It is suspected, and I have to insist on that, but not officially proven, of causing a birth defect that results in babies born with abnormally small heads. Well, this leads us to our question of the week, which asks, what questions would you like to ask doctors about the Zika virus? Well, before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for using all our social media platforms to communicate to us. And another reminder that we are tweeting live today. Use the hashtag VOA Zika virus. And if you haven't yet, please do follow us at VOA Shaka. And speaking of it, let's go to a tweet from King Chroma, who writes, I really want to know the cause and how it's transmitted from person to person. Another tweet says, I want to know whether the children being born had mental defects and retarded growth. I'm going to take a look at one last one while we're at it, this time from Omeria, who says, is it true it was first discovered in Uganda? Well, let's now turn to our Facebook followers. We'll go to a comment from Kasuru Charles from Mud, Khorasan in Iran, who writes, does the Zika virus only affect pregnant women? Well, Esther and Guess, obviously a lot of questions here. We have a range of them. Who wants to dive in?
Thank you very much, Mariama. They are great questions from our viewers, definitely. And let me take a cue from one of our viewers here and ask you, Dr. Josh Mitchell, how long does it take for one to show symptoms of Zika virus? Because we know even from a common cold, you get infected, but it takes you a couple of days before you can say, something is not right with me.
Well, there is some variation between the time from when you are bitten with a mosquito, say that's carrying the Zika virus, and you begin to show symptoms, and that might range from a couple of days to maybe a week or a little bit more. But it's a fairly short time frame that we're talking about here where you would show symptoms. Now, one thing to note is that in apparently 80% of the people who are infected with Zika, they don't show any symptoms whatsoever. And so they are actually asymptomatic. Even though they have been infected, the virus doesn't cause any symptoms in their bodies. And among the 20% that do show symptoms, they have those mild symptoms that we've talked about, the rash and the red eyes and the fever. So it causes symptoms only in a small proportion of the people.
All right, Mariama, please share more of our audience feedback.
Great point there, because there are cases where absolutely there are no symptoms. Let's move on to a comment from John Segun in Lagos, Nigeria, who writes, what are the early symptoms of Zika and what measures can be taken to prevent an infection, especially in third world countries? Another Facebook comment comes from Peter Sishizia in Zambia, who posted this question on our Facebook wall, asking what can Africa do to prevent the Zika virus from reaching the continent? Once again, Esther and Guess, some basic questions, but questions nonetheless.
Oh, indeed, very great. I'm going to take the last one to Ron. What can Africa do?
I think it's a really interesting question, because we've said before that the Zika virus actually has its origins in Africa. So to say how to prevent it from reaching Africa makes things a little difficult. It is in Africa, as far as we know. The problem is that we really don't know the extent of the range of the virus, nor do we know what the consequences of the virus are in different places. That's why surveillance is is the key to this whole enigma that we're facing. We have to have better surveillance in African countries. We have to know how many cases of Zika virus there might be. We have to know separately how many cases of microcephaly or Guillain-Barré there might be occurring in Africa. We have not shined the light on these conditions in most African countries. And I suspect that when we do, we will find more cases than we are currently aware of. But we don't know if it will be a few more, or tens more, or hundreds more, or thousands more. We just don't know. So again, I think the World Health Organization has done the right thing to bring the focus of the scientific community, of the media, and of the public onto this worrying condition, worrying because it affects unborn children. And we'll be able, by having done that, to coordinate our efforts. The simple fact of the matter is, and I don't like to say this, but I'm afraid it's the truth, we don't have enough information yet to answer many of these very, very good questions that are coming from the viewers and listeners.
All right, Carol, you wanted to say something before the break.
Oh, no, it was just, we were talking about what would happen. The Zika virus went from Southeast Asia and hopped across the Pacific until it got to South America, Brazil. And that was my question for Dr. Fauci, too. What happens because of international travel when this is reintroduced to parts of Africa?
Especially when somebody travels even from South America to Africa, or even from Africa to South America.
I want to make the point about detection again, because one of the places that it went to, there have been very few, only hundreds of cases reported since 1947 of Zika virus infection, because, as we've said here several times, it's a rather mild disease and nobody's really paid very much attention to it. There was an outbreak in 2007 in a place called Yap Island in the South Pacific. And that was it was less than 100 cases. And then in 2013, there was another outbreak in French Polynesia. And the outbreak was documented. It was 300 and some cases. And they just reported the outbreak, and people more or less forgot about it. When the outbreak occurred in late 2015 in Brazil and seemed to be associated with microcephaly, the public health authorities in Brazil got in contact with the public health authorities in French Polynesia and said to them, did you see any cases of microcephaly or other congenital malformations? They didn't know. They hadn't noticed it at the time. But when they went back and looked at their records and found the mothers of children who had been infected during that epidemic, they did find an increased rate of microcephaly and other congenital malformations. So this remains a situation where we're not going to know what has happened in the past until we look for it specifically.
Interesting observation there, Josh.
I think one important thing to note too is that in the cases, the outbreaks in Yap and French Polynesia that Ron was talking about, since then there have not been any cases diagnosed of this virus. And really the thought is that because you've been infected once, you get immunity to the virus and you can't be infected again. So when it enters a population that hasn't seen the virus before, people get infected, but then they're protected. We don't know all of the dynamics around this, but because across the Americas, nobody had seen the virus before, you had what's known as a naive population. So we seem to be experiencing this explosive growth in populations where there is no immunity. Now, once the immunity builds up in a population over time, you would see less of an explosive outbreak or actually absence of the virus. And because we don't know how much of the virus is in Africa at the moment, because surveillance isn't there, it might be part of the answer is that the virus has circulated there, people already have immunity to the virus. But I think more study needs to be done on that question.
Thanks, Mariama. Again, great observations there from our viewers. Let me turn to we've already talked to our experts. We'll get much more insight into the Zika virus. Mariama.
Well, thank you, Esther, and thank you to our guests for weighing in onto our audience's questions. This will do it for today's social media segment. Thanks to all of you, always for tuning in. And again, thank you for clarifying a bit some of the aspects of the Zika virus for them. Just a reminder that we appreciate all the feedback, whether it's in social media form or using other means to communicate to us. Please keep them coming. And if you are a new fan, just drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. Once again, our email address is africatv@voanews.com, or post your comment on our Facebook page. Just enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com, or you can join our YouTube channel. Sign up to VOA TV to Africa, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka.